Everyone, this is update for January 18, 2024, day 1060 of the war, end of the date update. Also catch up since January 14, which means January 15, 16, and 17. I'm going to start with general strategic update, actually macroeconomic update, and then I'm going to switch to situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. I'm going to focus quite a bit on China, as you can see from this macro data. Let's just first start with just general review what's going on in Chinese economy. There's a good amount of data that came out over past week. So first, China is doing very well export-wise. As you can see, it went up 10.7% relative to December of 23. Import is fairly subdued, grew only by 1%. So this is the best case scenario. This is kind of ideal scenario. How you would like it is basically exports growing and imports are, let's say, growing at very slow, much slower pace relative to export, which creates larger net difference, because if you take export minus import, that's essentially your net or profit or net income, whatever you want to call it. So that's your wealth generation from your export activities. And as you can see, China is doing pretty well. It's essentially generating significant amount of wealth from its export activities. And it's also reflected in trade balance, which is that net profit that I mentioned, which is grew to slightly above $100 billion. So export engine, export focus is the main wealth generator in China, and Chinese leadership basically switched China back to its old model of export or generating wealth through export, and so far it's working. The interesting part is that that relationship with Russia, for example, essentially stagnated in 2004. I think their export and import between two countries essentially was close to flat. I think it grew like 1% or at most 2%. So the economic relationship between the two countries into 2024 did not become stronger. Let's put this way. Then let's look at what's going on with real estate, and real estate continues to be problem zone in China. I would say disaster zone. It's area where China destroyed huge amount of that accumulated wealth that it accumulated from export, and then it managed to burn it, significant portion of it, by creating this huge real estate bubble that essentially we're seeing how it's deflating, and it's been deflating since probably at least 2021. That's what I would say what's available to outside observer from not someone who's not from China. Then the next important item is fixed asset investment, which slowly going down. That's obviously negative, and that's money spent on building new factories, essentially. Basically, the investment on building new factories, which obviously supports future export growth, and that's obviously that doesn't bode well for the future growth of Chinese export. Then GDP grew at 5.4%. At the same time, Chinese GDP number has very low credibility. Let's put it this way: there is quite a bit of fabrication or suspicion of fabrication there. Then industrial production grew significantly in December. At the same time, it's flat for the year. This is sort of being corroborated by this export growth. So that's because essentially all of the manufacturing is basically working towards export essentially. Then actually retail sales are relatively strong in China, as you can see. And then unemployment rate actually grew, which is not consistent, is not corroborating with sort of rosy picture that I was mentioning related to industrial production and export. It's totally possible that this is more related to the deflating real estate bubble, and that's construction and all of that is probably generating all of this negative results. I also want to mention sort of topic that's somewhat relevant to export and just general Chinese economy, and specifically to electric vehicle manufacturing in China, and actually relationship with Russia and generally oil-producing countries. So there's new statistics that came out from China that showed flat to actually declining oil import into China. So, and the reason for that is some people may think it's a weak Chinese economy. It's actually not weak Chinese economy. It's because China is switching to electric vehicles at ever larger sort of size. So Chinese consumers are buying more and more, or basically switching to electric vehicles. China is even trying to push electric vehicles into the trucking industry, which I don't think is going to work. But the likely reason for this is strategy of Chinese leadership, where they want to reduce reliance on foreign sources of energy, or specifically on crude oil, because I think 80% of plus minus might be slightly wrong, but roughly 80% of Chinese oil consumption is being imported from all over the world. And in case of any conflict or anything like that, that's going to be significant. It's going to be impaired, and so then Chinese economy obviously will stop. So I think what Chinese leadership is doing in terms of long-term plan is to switch to electric vehicles, which are sourced by domestic energy, and so you are becoming insulated from the effect of, let's say, oil embargo, if it may happen in case of, let's say, invasion of Taiwan. So the way it probably works is the following. China has probably second largest or the largest deposits of coal in the world, and so then Chinese leadership is building coal-fired electricity power plants that produce a lot of electricity, basically convert that coal into electricity. And then China has second largest deposits of lithium, which are used in batteries. And so then you are able to produce or be leader in the production of accumulators. And then you essentially can accumulate that energy in those accumulators and also use for EVs and have those EVs relatively cheap. They still, just because of the nature of physics, EVs are always inferior to internal combustion engines, and they always will be until we run out of oil, which I don't think is happening anytime soon. So at the same time, China generally has pretty lax regulatory regime, so that really reduces the cost of these EVs. Plus, that's probably a reason why China is building so many coal-fired plants, because coal is very cheap. So in order to make this whole ecosystem competitive, or relatively competitive to internal combustion engine or conventional energy, you have to have chip components to reduce the cost in every single component. So using cheap coal, you're building those power plants, which are also inexpensive because it's pretty primitive technology. And then you have internal lithium deposits, which are also relatively cheap for China. And then you have basically non-existent environmental regulations. So the whole chain is becoming relatively competitive. I won't say it's absolutely competitive, but it's close enough. And in case of you basically paying some premium for essentially national security in case that supply of crude oil is severed to China. And so that's most likely what is happening in China. And then what Chinese government also probably decided to do to actually impose the standards on the rest of the world, knowing that the rest of the world will be in disadvantage relative to China, because most of the world does not use as much coal. It's using, let's say, natural gas, which is more expensive, but not hugely so. But then in Europe, it went to the in complete overdrive, where they use essentially wind and solar energy, which is insanely expensive and absolutely non-competitive. And then also the rest of the world does not have cheap deposits of lithium. So again, everybody is going to be essentially dependent on Chinese. So first of all, the rest of the world will not be competitive to China in this new world and new paradigm, simply because China is using coal to generate electricity, and then uses accumulators produced from cheap lithium mined inside of China. And then China is dominating accumulator production in the world. So essentially everybody is going to be critically dependent on China, and that really creates a huge political leverage against pretty much anyone who adopts this new sort of so-called green energy, which is, as I stated, this has nothing to do with being green. It has everything to do with China's strategy and China's long-term plan, essentially, to have huge leverage or essentially control over a significant portion of the West. It's obviously failed in the U.S., where there's new administration and they're reversing course. That obviously will crash this plan, likely plan that I described. And then obviously that will put Europe in a very difficult situation, where all of this unrealistic things that's being done, especially in Germany, they are also collapsing because they're absolutely uneconomical and impossible to generally maintain. So at the same time, China can continue with its own course and just kind of keep it within its sort of national boundaries, and it still could be sort of viable solution, especially as I mentioned, because there is national security concern that China doesn't want to depend much on foreign oil, and that's probably one of the reasons why the economic relationship between China and Russia are not sort of expanding, simply because China does not need as much oil anymore. So it's not just Russia, it's all other crude oil exporters. So I think this is probably in a nutshell what is happening with this whole green new energy that's being pushed in the West. And that's probably the whole root cause where it's all coming from, essentially. I just want to switch to sort of related topic, and that's who owns U.S. Governmental debt. So what I mean is U.S. government is borrowing money, and who basically is lending money what countries are lending money to the US government. And they actually, what I mentioned many times before, the main capital provider or lender to the US is actually Japan. But Japan, as you can see, is essentially stagnant or actually slowly reducing its holdings of the US government debt. So which really means that Japan is no longer buyer of the US government debt issuances. And similar but much more drastic situation is happening in China. And China was used to be a number 2 provider of capital to the US. It used to have actually over 1 trillion of the US Treasury holdings, and now it's down to, as you can see, 768 billion. So China is not recycling that profit that I mentioned through the export activity. What they're doing, they're essentially they're buying up natural resources around the world and mostly focusing on Africa. So essentially, they decided not to finance U.S. Government debt, but they actually decided to buy hard assets. And that's obviously related to the Chinese sort of strategy and plan, where they essentially want to develop leverage and control over the rest of the world. So then when I mention Taiwan, as you can see, is another important, relatively important provider of capital actually to the US. As you can see, it grew significantly from 238 to 286. And Taiwan is in similar way to China and, let's say, South Korea, Japan, other countries in Southeast Asia that are export oriented. So Taiwan is recycling its profits, which mostly from semiconductor manufacturing, back to the US. And then also Hong Kong, but that's probably more financial. So could be very, doesn't mean that this is sort of purely Chinese money. It could be because it's a still financial hub, so it could be pulling money from the rest of the Asia to invest in U.S. governmental debt. Now, I'm gonna switch a little bit closer to Ukraine. I want to mention about the Russia-Iran new strategic partnership. And I just want to confirm what I mentioned before, that it's not the same as a relationship with North Korea. It's very clear that Iran is not willing to go sort of as far as North Korea. And the most both sides agree to is, in case if there are sanctions or there is open conflict with whoever, they're not going to support the enemy of either side. So let's say this really means that Russia attacked Ukraine, so Iran is not going to be supporting Ukraine, let's say. And in the same way, if Iran is being attacked by, I don't know, US or Israel, obviously Russia is not going to support the efforts of US or Israel. So this is fairly, I would say, limited cooperation. It's more of essentially, in some ways, you can just say that both countries are not going to support sanctions against each other if they are being sort of sanctioned by a third party. It's essentially, it's obviously a primitive way to over primitivizing it, but that's essentially what is happening there. Now let's actually switch to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, and I'm gonna do walkthrough in a clockwise fashion, the way I always do, starting from north, and I'm gonna jump to Kursk region of Russia, where things somewhat sort of on pause by Russian side, so hard to explain why, maybe regrouping, but the pressure has subsided. But at the same time, the strategic goal remains the same, obviously, to squeeze Ukrainian forces out of Kursk region of Russia. And that plan is sort of remains on course and slowly but surely is being implemented by Russia. Now let's look situation northeast of Kharkiv. Things here are on pause. Russia does not have extra resources to continue their attack on Kharkiv. Now let's look at North Lugansk front line. Things somewhat more stable here. Doesn't mean that things are sort of normal. It's just sort of collapse of the front line is happening in extremely slow pace. The Russian troops did not manage to capture village Kolodzy, and it's very, I think, obvious here. After Kolodzy, next goal is this town Liman, which is sort of key in this whole area. So that's sort of immediate goal for Russian troops, but again, they are lacking sort of free resources and reserves to continue the push. Now let's look at north, moving south to North Donbass front line. The northern sector essentially quiet, much going on there. Then the southern portion of the sector is the only area sort of where it's active is Chasiv Yar and south of Chasiv Yar. So situation in Chasiv Yar is essentially Ukrainian forces are being pushed to the western outskirts of the town, so which really means that the town is going to be lost relatively soon. Hard to say, maybe in a week, maybe less, maybe 10 days, but essentially at this point it's very predefined and it's very clear that this is happening and happening fairly soon. And then there will be sort of essentially a large retreat towards Konstantinivka, and this whole area is going to get lost. That's east of Konstantinivka. And then Russian troops continue their pressure along this road towards Konstantinivka from Stupachki, but without huge so far success. But again, this is just a question of Ukrainian forces being squeezed completely out of Chasiv Yar, and then that's essentially the beginning of sort of a large withdrawal towards Konstantinivka. Now let's move some more south to central Donbass, where it's the worst situation strategically for Ukraine. So the main focus of Russian Russian troops is basically expanding and getting to this road E50 that's going sort of north west from Pokrosvsk, which is sort of main artery, transport artery for Ukrainian forces. And essentially at this point it's to extent not usable. And let's just look at the situation a little bit closer. So this is this E50. Russian troops managed to cross this road that goes through Udachne, Kotlyne towards Pokrosvsk, and they are moving sort of north of it. As you can see, it's not that huge difference, probably like 5 kilometers to E50. And what this really means is that Russian troops at this point can use FPV or just generally drones or UAVs to attack Ukrainian supplies that are being sort of provided through E50, and that's a whole first step in capturing Pokrovsk is to secure logistics of Ukrainian army. This is obviously not going to happen right now. It's just making more difficult because you still have this road that goes north from Pokrovsk, which is still fairly unreachable for Russian troops, and still ensures that Ukrainian forces getting sufficient supplies in Pokrovsk. But this is essentially, I'm just explaining this, where this is going. And at the same time, Russian troops also trying to expand straight west. So you can see they also they captured eastern side part of Udachne and essentially pushing west. And the same way they pushing west south of Udachne. And most likely they're going to be attacking this village Novosilka in short order. So that's essentially main focus of attack. And then there's another one that's sort of supporting it is attacking also west. West of Nadiivka, essentially Russian troops close to be done with capturing Nadiivka, and then they will continue pushing westwards. As you can see, there's just open fields, which makes it much easier to move forward. Now let's look a little bit of sort of southern part of the same central Donbass front line. Ukrainian troops are in process of withdrawing to this sort of line, Andriivka, Lakle, Constantinople. So this is going to be next significant objective for Russian troops, and another significant stronghold by Ukrainian forces. After which there is essentially nothing really major left. It's fairly small villages all the way to essentially Dnipro River. And then another important Ukrainian stronghold, Velyka Novosilka, is essentially in process of being lost. It's probably also, I don't know, another week, maybe less, maybe 10 days, maybe 15 days, but it's going to be lost pretty quickly. So essentially, it's the supply there is severed. Russian troops already actually attacking Velyka Novosilka, so there is already fighting going on to essentially to capture it. And as I stated, supply is to this Ukrainian troops here is severed at this point. So there's also reports that some of the Ukrainian troops are surrendering in Velyka Novosilka. So this is obviously reflects level of morale. That's, I would say, in the past it wasn't typical, but at the same time, as you can see, they semi-encircled, essentially very little supply of anything, and also opportunity to get out of this half pocket is extremely problematic, because they're essentially going through this corridor of fire where chances of getting killed are pretty high. So many troops are choosing basically to surrender to Russian forces here. Now let's move to Zaporizhya front line. Things here are quiet. Nothing is happening here. The last section of the front line along the Dnipro River, where things also quiet. Nothing is going on there either. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye-bye.